we will kick it off. All right, so welcome everybody. We are so excited to introduce Professor Bridgette Carr, who's with us today as part of our DE&I speaker series. The theme for this month, as many of you know, and maybe some of you don't, is community impact. And Bridgette has had a profound community impact through all of the work that she's done in the human trafficking victim advocacy, as well as policy advancement space. We first had the pleasure of meeting Bridgette as her role as a clinical professor of law at the University of Michigan through some L&D work that we wanted some advice on. But in addition to that role, she's also the founding director of the University of Michigan's Law School's Human Trafficking Clinic, which is the first clinical law program solely devoted to addressing this issue that we'll talk about today. She's dedicated her career to advocating for the rights of human trafficking victims. And is really advancing comprehensive domestic and international anti-trafficking policies. So she has an awesome presentation today. A few other things to highlight is that she does provide human trafficking training to law enforcement, government officials, and healthcare providers, which is amazing, as well as kind of appearing publicly and talking about this issue as an expert on the Today Show. And is part and has been a member of the Michigan Human Trafficking Task Force for quite some time, and is really, when we first met her and she started talking about kind of this passion in this space, we knew that she would be an amazing fit for meeting our folks at Keystone and talking more to us about this. So we're super excited to have Bridgette today. She would like to take questions throughout, so people can feel free to use the chat area, as well as just unmute and asking your questions as we go along. So with that, I will hand it over to Bridgette. She will share, and we're looking forward to this talk. So Bridgette, I'll hand it to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz and Rachel. And I'm so excited to be here. And I just want to start with one quick note, especially since this is going to be recorded forever and ever. This far into the pandemic, I do have a much different background if I was at home, but we have been without power for 36 hours and now without internet for 8. So we had to hop in the car and go to my in-laws. And so I'm in the corner of my in-laws' master bedroom or primary bedroom. And so I just want to say that I know how to do it better if you're in a room rate or space like this far into the pandemic. So I really want to encourage folks. My goal for you all today is that you leave having any question or any assumption you have about human trafficking answered. And so don't hesitate to interrupt me. I have 3 kids, ages 10 and under, and I teach law students. Already, I've completed more sentences in a row than I generally get to complete in either my personal or my professional life. So you will not throw me off my game. Also, there's just no question really about this topic that will be that's dumb to ask or will make me feel uncomfortable or anything like that. So I really want this to be a conversation. And so to start off the conversation, I thought it might help for me to share how did I get here? And I think really important for doing human trafficking work is, how do I know what I know? Because so many folks in the human trafficking space, unfortunately, talk about trafficking without actually knowing anything real. And so how did I get here is a much longer story, but the shorthand version is, I grew up in northeastern Indiana. I'm the first in my family to go to college and then to law school. I thought that my dream was to be a doctor. So I did 5 days of medical school before I dropped out. When I dropped out, I think my parents were just relieved I wasn't unmarried and pregnant. There was so many tears when I told them, and they accepted the dropout much easier. As I got older and didn't have children, I think my mom looked back and wish I had been pregnant. So I dropped out of med school, was really lost, and found my way into law school and thought I was going to do work helping immigrants and refugees, and did that work for a while until I got my first ever human trafficking case, which also happened to be the state of Michigan's first ever human trafficking case, prosecuted federally. And from there, my career kind of took off. So it was completely unintentional. And I guess part of the reason that I say that to any group I talk to is if you're just feeling like you haven't found your calling yet, or you just aren't not sure what's coming next, like, it's okay. I think sometimes folks look at people like me and think like I came into the world and was handed this secret memo that told me how to be an expert of human trafficking, and it's been a straightforward path and just hasn't been. And so yeah, so that's, and then how do I know what I know? Well, I'm a law professor, but really I'm a lawyer and a teacher of people who want to be lawyers. So I founded and direct the Human Trafficking Clinic. And that means my students get class credit for representing survivors of human trafficking. And so I teach them how to interview survivors. We go to court and the students do the lawyering on the case, and I am kind of their safety net. I make sure that they don't commit malpractice. But what that really means is that my knowledge of human trafficking comes from doing on the ground cases. Yes, I do research. I know how to read, right? Like I read stuff too, but like I know survivors day in and day out and learn from them. And so our clinic represents survivors regardless of their age, their gender, their nationality, what type of victimization. And you can think of us as a small legal aid office that does all sorts of things. If your legal need is tied to trafficking, or even if we can like barely tie it to trafficking, we will take your case. So I want to go over a few ways that we might hear about human trafficking in the news. And really, if I don't cover something you're wondering about, like, let's talk about it, because so often the media has a portrayal of human trafficking that doesn't match reality. And I just want to flag from the very beginning, and you'll probably hear me talking about it over and over, the media really has a portrayal of human trafficking that tells you that people that look like me are at risk of trafficking, that white girls, women are the victims of trafficking. And it's a narrative that embeds systemic racism and power and privilege. And it's one that just doesn't match who my clients are. And so I want us to keep thinking about that theme of what is racism doing here and those sorts of things as we're thinking about how we're taught about human trafficking. And that's a lot to think about on a like Friday in August, but I think we can do it. So the first thing I want to flag for us is that the words sex trafficking and human trafficking are often used as synonyms. And human trafficking actually contains both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. We're going to get into the weeds of those definitions. But what I want to flag there is that oftentimes people will say human trafficking when they only mean sex trafficking. So examples might be, you can hear of an organization like hotels, Delta Airlines, Truckers Against Trafficking, and other things will say, we're doing training on human trafficking. We are training all our employees on human trafficking. And when you look, well, you wouldn't, but I do this. When I look at the training, I see that they're only talking about sex trafficking, which means we're not talking about the people who clean our hotel rooms, right? We're not talking about the people who might be serving us food or those sorts of things. So it's just really important that when we hear that phrase human trafficking, we say to ourselves, is this talking about both sex and labor? And if it's not, why are we making a whole group of victims invisible? Okay. You may have heard this concept that there is an average age of entry into the sex industry. I flag this one. It's not used as much anymore, but I flag it because it's a very interesting example about how something that was actually real gets translated into something false. So there is a narrative that the average age of entry into the sex industry is anything between 11 and 13 for boys or girls. Now, this comes from a study from the University of Pennsylvania, and this study was done only on children in the sex industry. So I am not a mathematician, nor do I fancy myself really strong in statistics, but if you only ask kids something, you will get and then average the age of the people that you ask, you will get an average age that is low because only kids answered the question. And so we don't actually know what the average age for people to enter the sex industry is, but people will use that as often a scare tactic about sort of be afraid, that your kids, usually your wealthy white people in the suburbs, kids are going to be snatched and put into the commercial sex industry. So I'd be curious, you can just like raise your hand or thumbs up. Who has heard this statement? The Super Bowl represents like a huge increase in sex trafficking, or is the most sex trafficking ever happening in the universe of all time, or the Super Bowl is coming to town, sex trafficking is going to spike. So this, thank you. Yeah, this is a super common narrative, and you can translate or you can substitute lots of things from the Super Bowl. It could be a political convention, Democrat or Republican. It could be, if you're from the Michigan region, the North American Auto Show. It can be World Cup soccer. I'm not picking on the Super Bowl. But so what's really interesting about this narrative is that, for one, we often say that human trafficking is going to spike, and about the Super Bowl, we mean only sex trafficking. And two, this narrative really makes us feel good about what's happening around human trafficking in our communities every other day. Because if I only have to worry about human trafficking one day a year, I don't have to wonder what's happening in my community on any given Tuesday. If I think that people are only going to buy other people, right, are only going to purchase sexual services when the Super Bowl comes to town, I don't have to wonder what the buyers of sex are doing in my community on any given Tuesday, because I act like it's only people from out of town cause the problem. So it's not true. And there's actually no data to support that there's a spike when the Super Bowl comes to town. Another thing that we'll see is different communities laying claim to being the number one thing for human trafficking or child sex trafficking or a hotspot or a corridor, or we have a gold star because it happens the most here in some way. We don't know. There is no prevalence number in America for trafficking. So I just want to make that clear. There's no prevalence number. So we just don't know. Okay, so here's where I want to stop. And I really want to see, and we're going to get into definitions, we're going to get into the weeds, all of those things. But I want to stop because I think that I've found that when I do these trainings, people come with questions about human trafficking, and I just want to help them sort of like get it out there at the beginning. Is there something I didn't touch on? Do you want to know if Wayfair sells human beings? Do you want, like, what might you want to know that I didn't cover in that quick like overview of trying to take all the myths down? Because there's a lot more myths. I did not cover them all, but I just wanted to give a quick opportunity. So I'm going to take a sip of my water and give you a second to see if anyone has any. Oh, you guys are all human trafficking experts, which is totally fine. No, as we go on, like anytime, any question that pops up, I'm happy to answer.
Can I ask a question really quickly?
Yes.
Heavy question for like my 10th day on the job, but
all good.
Okay. I was wondering, you're talking about how like when you're saying human trafficking kind of synonymously with like paying for sex, and I was wondering how you determine whether that it's human trafficking or just prostitution.
Great. So that's a great question. So what I'm flagging there in the beginning is that we don't want to ignore labor trafficking, right? We want to make sure that we're saying human trafficking in the US context is majority sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And then in other countries, there's also organ trafficking. I'm mostly talking about the US context. Your question about is within the commercial sex industry, there is consensual sex work, voluntary sex work. There's a lot of labels. And then some people might say there's 3 buckets: consensual sex work, voluntary sex work, exploitive sex work, and which is not as great as voluntary as far as like working conditions, but doesn't cross the line into trafficking. And then there's trafficking. Other people might say there's 2 buckets, which is sex work, consensual sex work, and sex trafficking. And then there is a group of people that will say it's all sex trafficking. So I'm not in that group of people. I am in the law tells us that for adults, the line between sex work by choice and sex trafficking is, for adults, if there's force, fraud, or coercion. And for people under the age of 18 at the federal level, each state is different. People under the age of 18, their age is what tells us it's not consensual. Now, people will ask me, well, isn't it hard like to draw that line, and don't you get caught up in figuring out what's consensual and what's not? And the answer is, I really look forward to the day where things are really like blurry and ambiguous on that line. Right now, 10 years in, all the cases I get are really way over here, right? They're, easily identifiable as force, fraud, or coercion. There are people, coming to us and saying, I'm being harmed, I want help, that sort of thing. So I definitely think that but someday, hopefully, we're going to have to be at that line and figure some of that out, but we're not there yet. The other piece is that, the reality in America is that we criminalize in almost every jurisdiction people who sell sex, but we don't criminalize people who buy it. And I really struggle with that because even if we might disagree on whether we want the buying and selling of sex to be legal, I hope we can all agree that that arresting a group of people that are not potentially victims of sex trafficking is not a way to help move the area forward. But we don't seem to all agree on that. So it's a very interesting space where even some of the county that I live in, we recently elected a prosecutor who made the decision to announce that he will not be prosecuting any sex crime, commercial sex crime that's voluntary. Like he'll still prosecute trafficking, but he will not prosecute anything that's on this other side. And people are really pushing back on that. They say it's going to harm victims of trafficking. And my experience with my clients is that they are arrested so often and put in jail, and that this might give them a different experience with law enforcement, that then they might be able to get help. That's the experience I'm seeing from my clients. That was a very long answer, but yeah, that's sort of the world stuff. Other questions?
That was super interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a great question. Other questions?
Professor Carr, I have a question. Maybe you will cover this later on in your presentation. I was just curious, as a society, why is it difficult for us to prevent sex trafficking or human trafficking in general? Is it more like a political will, a law enforcement capability, social awareness, or some international limitations? If you can give some thoughts on that, that would be great.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on this. I think I think one thing is just like, despite the narratives around human trafficking in the media, that it's essentially a unicorn, that it's foreign, that it's exotic, that it never happens, that it's super unique, it's just another way that people take advantage of vulnerability for profit. And unfortunately, that seems to be baked in to so many things our society and the world does. And so I think the biggest barrier to combating human trafficking is that we don't like to think about vulnerability in our communities, right? That's not a comfortable place for us to sit in. And when we're uncomfortable, we often then just want to avoid it or say that thing doesn't happen in our community. I think the other piece is that if we truly sat in the knowledge of how many goods and services every single one of us, myself included, consume that are created by exploited labor, it would get pretty uncomfortable. Like our supply chains of goods that come to us, so much of that is baked in. And so, then I think the third thing that happens is it feels so overwhelming, right? Because you're like, I can't, every time I eat food or, I buy clothes, I can't figure out, or buy chocolate, like I can't figure out whether that was created by exploited labor or not. I'm overwhelmed. So I don't know what to do. And so one tip I give to people is, don't expect to live like a slave-free life, essentially, is kind of the narrative that people talk about. Just try to be thoughtful, even if it's just in one area, about the goods and services you consume, or about how you talk about people. how you talk about, foreign nationals in America. When we dehumanize people, we help traffickers, because trafficking is at its core turning a human being into a commodity. But I think trafficking is just like so many other forms of exploitation and abuse. The problem feels so big, and we don't have really good levers that we're willing to pull to decrease vulnerability. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a good answer.
Okay, oh yeah, Ben.
In that same vein, what are the industries in which trafficked labor is of particular concern?
So I would just now say any industry where there is a way to exploit vulnerability for profit, you're likely at some point to find exploited labor. And the reason I say that is I'll go through and sort of show you the industries that kind of are the top 25 in America, but you'll start to say like, well, what's not on that list? I mean, it just starts to be so many. But the other piece that may resonate more for some of you, I don't have a sense like how many people on the call might have like a master's or PhD degrees. But for some of you who are familiar with that experience, we've represented a number of people who are grad students who were trafficked by their PhD advisor. And if you're at all familiar with the power a PhD advisor has over you, especially if you're a foreign national, it's very akin to how our farm worker system is set up, meaning if you come in to study from a foreign country under your advisor controls whether you're deported or not. Because if your advisor would tell immigration that you're not advancing along the path correctly, I mean, I'm generalizing because I don't have a PhD, but I understand, like, then you could be deported. And so we have seen in multiple cases where PhD advisors have forced their PhD students to work in commercial companies that they own for no pay to make money, or under threat of, I will say you're not completing your PhD. And so I just give that as an example of where you can very clearly see that power and control of the PhD advisor with the student. And it's probably not an area, Ben, that you think of right away as trafficking, nor was it one that I really had. And so I mean, I think the other area that's in the news now a lot is the US Olympics. There are a number of cases pending in the criminal legal system around whether the US Olympic Committee is committing labor trafficking, like benefiting off of the labor of these athletes and creating these horrible working conditions. And the athletes have no other route unless they go through the US Olympic Committee. So I'm not an Olympic athlete. And so I didn't know this until I started working on these cases. But if you want to go to the Olympics, let's say you're really good, I'm just going to make it up, fencer, and you have a fencing coach in high school and you want to train under that coach all the way to the Olympics, the US Olympic Committee in general doesn't allow that to happen. You have to use the coaches in their system, as many of us know because of the Larry Nassar case, the doctors in their system. And so there's no other way to like get to the medals unless it's through the US Olympic Committee. So you can kind of think of them as like a visa system, right? Like you have to get the US Olympic Committee visa to go through. And anytime someone has that much control over you, exploitation can happen. I hope those were examples that kind of help, that are not the typical sort of farm worker, not to minimize what happens in those situations, but I try to give the idea of how the power and control can exist in lots of spaces. Okay, these are great questions. So I'm going to share my screen because I know you guys are dying for the legal definitions of trafficking. Like you've got your pen and paper out. I just know it. So what is trafficking? We've talked a ton about it already, but sort of the layperson's way I like to think about it is it's compelled service. It's when someone with power compels someone who's vulnerable to do some form of service. And this definition, the one I put here, would capture both sex and labor trafficking. I try to talk about, when I talk about human trafficking, I try to talk about it to cover both. So don't freak out. I just want y'all to see it. These are the legal definitions that come from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. There's severe forms of human trafficking and and two kinds, sex and labor, and those are the two definitions. I have them there. I'm going to keep going though, because I'll break the phrases down for you in the next few slides. So this one is labor trafficking, and all three of them you can think about as having a process or like a bunch of verbs, means, right, like the compulsion part, and then an end game. So the process for labor trafficking can be like, I can recruit you, right? Like I might have, these are will all in general be examples of real cases we've done. I may own a carnival company. And so I will recruit white men from South Africa who might not have a lot of education and might be pretty poor. I'll have them sign a really horrible document that says if they come home early from the season here, they won't get paid the majority of their pay, or I can take like a bunch of money from them or their parents' home. So I might recruit them to the United States. I might harbor them, right? Like might house them. I might move them around from, carnival place to carnival place, or obtain them. That's kind of a broader word, like get them in some way. So I get a person. What I want to flag for you, everyone here, is that movement is just one of the verbs. So trafficking has this stereotype around it that I must take you across an international line, a state line, a township line. No, you can be born in your town, never leave your town, and be a victim of trafficking, because I could recruit, harbor, or obtain you. Okay, so just really important to know that movement is just one piece. So then I've got to do it by force or fraud or coercion. And I want everyone to just pick one of those words there, force or fraud, coercion, and which word you think does the most work when we're doing a case. Just pick the word you think is the most important in your head. Okay, it's or. The word that is most important is or. I don't need to prove force and fraud and coercion. I don't need my client to be beaten and defrauded and coerced. I don't, despite what the movies tell you or what the narrative around trafficking around trafficking in the media tells you. I just need to meet one of those standards. And the standard that most often happens in cases is coercion, because coercion doesn't leave any outward physical marks, which means less evidence, which means harder to prosecute, which means better for traffickers. And so in many of our cases, psychological coercion is all that we have, and that is enough. Legally, is it enough always for a prosecutor to bring a case? Whole different question, but is it enough to meet the standard? Yes. And then for labor trafficking, you're looking for involuntary servitude, debt bondage, or slavery, which are, so just to set it up for people who are super interested in legal history, this area of law starts with the 13th Amendment, which then moves to debt bondage laws, which then moves to involuntary servitude laws, which then moves to human trafficking laws. So all of these laws are connected, and it's sort of saying that human trafficking ties back to all of those. Okay. Any questions before I move to sex trafficking? I'm not sure I can see the chat. I can't remember because I haven't taught in a while. So okay, good. Liz is telling me I'm good. So, but you can also unmute and just ask me.
You said coercion was like the most common of the middle box. What's the most common of the first box?
Well, lots of people harbor. So in almost every case, like they're housing someone or they have someone, but that first part of the case is usually never hard to prove. I mean, here's something I didn't share at the beginning and I should have. So there's this huge myth out there that most people are trafficked by people they don't know. So this was really frustrating us in the human trafficking clinic. And so we went back and surveyed all of our cases. And I forget the exact number, but it's between 90 and 98. Between 90 and 98% of our clients were trafficked by someone they knew, that they already had a relationship with, whether it was someone they were like blood related to, whether it was someone that they were friends with long before this happened, whether it was someone who employed them. And so that recruiting, harboring part is, or obtain is such a big word, like a big verb, is right there. So it's just, trafficking is a crime of relationship. Oh, Laura, did you have more question?
Yeah, I did. Because you mentioned it's someone they knew, and the thing that always goes through my head, like I know with kidnapping, it's often like kind of an opportunistic thing, but to me, it felt are these folks who are entering into relationships where one party is like already a bad actor, or is this like, is there some weird crime of opportunity version of trafficking that I haven't understood or thought about?
So there could, I mean, I'm not saying that no one ever in the history of all types of trafficking has ever been snatched in Europe and forced into a trafficking ring run by Arab men who, you know, want to sell them on a ship before Liam Neeson rescues them. Like, right, like I'm not saying that that never happens. What I am saying is that in all the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases I've worked on, none of my clients have ever been snatched. Ever.
No, yeah, no, totally. I guess I'm just like trying to understand, you know, the difference between like your uncle kidnaps you and they already know you versus like someone tries to make friends with you because they like are thinking about that.
Yes, I definitely think look, it's weird to say this because this is going to come out wrong. And so I hope I can explain it in a way. Doing this much work on trafficking and working as many times I have with traffickers and talking to them and hearing about how they identify the people they exploit, once you have that lens of kind of what vulnerability looks like in the world, like I can kind of walk on campus some days and say like, oh, that's where I would start. If I was trying to pick someone who looks maybe a little left out, alone, not confident, right? Like you can see that. And so what you find is that traffickers are really good at identifying vulnerability. Like maybe, you know, not you, but like, you know, maybe there's someone who has been kicked out of their house or just got, you know, is in foster care and just doesn't feel like anyone in the world cares for them. So I'm going to tell that person that I care for them, that I love them. And right, maybe I'll send them gifts at first. And so, you know, I'll create that relationship, sometimes called grooming, right? Like, and so that they trust me and they believe in me, and it's really effective. Or maybe I am going to recruit people from a foreign country to come work here, and the dream of working in America is so powerful that even if your job is really crappy, but yet you're still sending home $100 a month to your family in Ethiopia, like I'm thinking of my one client, like you just kind of go, it's worth it, even though it's horrible. But that doesn't make what the trafficker is doing legal, right? Like all those things can be true. The victim can think it's worth it, but it can still be illegal. Does that help? Yeah. And all of those things I just described are kind of cases that we have had. Okay. Oh, so now I'm on sex trafficking. And so sex trafficking, this is for adults, the way the screen is set up right now. And sex trafficking is set up very similarly, except it has a few more verbs. So I can recruit someone, I can harbor someone, I can move someone, I can obtain someone. And now for sex trafficking, and this was added about 8 years after the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed, they added in the verbs patronize or solicit. And the idea being, they wanted to make it really clear that it is still sex trafficking, and especially in cases of minors, that if someone tries to purchase a minor, like you all are probably way too young for this, but there used to be this show like To Catch a Predator or something, where there would be these stings and like law enforcement would pretend they were a 13-year-old girl online, and these men would show up to commit the crime, and they would be arrested. And so there were all these court cases of like, is the patronizing of a victim of sex trafficking essentially trafficking? And the answer is, the Congress wanted to make it really clear. The answer is yes. So that's why that's there. We have the same means. And then in this case, our end is for the purposes of a commercial sex act. And what's really important about this part of the definition is that word commercial. So I'll have lots of people call my office or tell me about things that are really horrible, right? They're really horrible. And yet they fall under the umbrella of sexual assault intimate partner violence, something like that, because there's no commercial element to the sex act. I mean, so a commercial sex act requires that you exchange a sex act for something of value. That something of value doesn't have to be cash or money. It can be food. It can be a place to sleep. It can be clothes, but there's got to be some sort of commercial transaction. Okay. That's what makes something trafficking versus something just sort of straight up sexual assault. So a great example of that is, I'm often asked, why is the abuse in the Catholic Church of priests to young boys not considered sex trafficking? And because in that case, like, I'm unaware and I haven't seen any evidence that that was for something, the sex acts were for exchange of something of value, right? Like that was sexual assault. And trafficking can often be multiple things, right? Like you can be assaulted, you can be sexually assaulted, and you can be a sex trafficker. Like all of those things can be true. It can be multiple things at the same time. Okay, Ben, did you have a question? I don't want to call you. I just want to make sure that. Okay. Now for kids, people under the age of 18, we just take out that middle box. The question really just is of age, but that's at the federal level. States have a whole hodgepodge of ways to do it. So it's way too much for today, but just know that each state does it differently. Okay, we've talked about this. We actually talked about this. I want to get to the typologies really quick. So, because I think this goes to the person who said, like, what types of trafficking? I think Ben asked what types of trafficking there are. And so this was put out by the Polaris Project, or who runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So they've identified the 25 types of trafficking most common in the United States. Each type has its own business model, and they have the caveat, as any like good consultancy group has, this does not represent a complete picture. I just want to flag for you all that you will start to wonder, like, what's left out, or what's this telling us? I don't know. This is the best we have on what the typologies are. So what I've done for each of these is I have put an underline under the ones that we've worked on in the human trafficking clinic, because people often want to know, like, what types of cases do you see in your clinic? And so I just think it helps to do that. So just underlined all the ones we've had. So we've done sex trafficking cases involving all of those typologies. And does anyone have questions about that? Are you like, I don't understand what those words mean? I wonder, like, why don't you have those cases? Anything like that.
What is the remote interactive sexual act?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that is much more common. It's essentially online. Like, it's like if I would like sign into something and I would have someone online, and then I would direct the person online to do certain things while I watched or something like that. But that is much more common for the victims to be in a foreign country and to be younger. And we just don't see those cases because those people wouldn't be in the US, and we represent people in the US. It's not that those cases aren't common. It would make sense that we wouldn't see those cases. And then we don't see, we do see strip club cases, but we see them in the labor trafficking context, and the cantina cases and bars are often more along the southern border of the United States. Again, not that those cases don't happen, but just where we sit in Michigan, we just don't see them as much.
I have a question. Sorry if this is like naive, or I guess I can just, like, when I think of sex trafficking, I think of like people who are, you know, at risk being trafficked for prostitution, basically. And I'm wondering if you have a view, like, this is a really expansive definition. Does it, like, by including all of like things like you see in the press, right? Like politicians paying for a plane ticket for someone who's like 17, right, to come have sex with them, totally illegal and bad. Like, do you think that, like, by the press branding all of these things sex trafficking, does that hurt the case of the people who are like the most at risk, or does it help like bring light to it?
Yeah, so you're talking about Matt Getz, and I, like, on social media when it first started coming out, even said, like, hey, I'm not a supporter of his, and yet nothing so far, like, I don't love that men his age are dating 17-year-old girls, but it's not illegal in that state. And so sending a plane ticket, if it's a real relationship, right, is could be like not what I want people in my life to do, but isn't necessarily illegal. Now, enough feels like more has come out about that case, that there's lots of other elements. But actually, what I will say is I don't think those kinds of cases are helpful at all. And here's why. Because what is the narrative of Matt Getz about? About people with power and money and privilege and power, and often white, who, again, it's like that story doesn't match almost any of my clients' story. I mean, it doesn't mean that what happened to these victims isn't important. I don't mean that. It's just all the air is taken up by those cases. And then you start to say why and how. Like the Jeffrey Epstein case is another example. Jeffrey Epstein did horrible things to people, horrible. He trafficked people for sure. It's awful. And yet, if we paint the picture that traffickers are bazillionaires with private islands and, you know, private planes who hobnob with, you know, everybody who's powerful and well-known, and not talk about the fact that it could be your favorite restaurant down the street and the owners who run it and you know them, but the kitchen help isn't being paid and is stuck in the shed in the back, right? Like if we're looking for Jeffrey Epstein as our trafficker, we're just missing it. And that's where I get really frustrated. And also because, you know, in the Jeffrey Epstein case, like powerful people can exploit that criminal legal system. And he did, right? Like he did over and over again. But yeah, yes, it very much frustrates me that those cases have all of the airtime for sure. Yeah. Here is the typology of labor trafficking. And yet again, thought it was helpful if I just tagged what we've seen in the human trafficking clinic. And then happy to answer any questions about either the things I tagged or the things I didn't tag, if people are interested. Any questions about those? They're pretty broad categories. Like I love illicit activities. Yeah, exactly.
For arts and entertainment, is that mostly athletics, or are there like athletics is just kind of what you've experienced more, but there are other?
It's not just athletics. Again, it's arts and entertainment can be acting, modeling, sort of like some people will promise aspiring models certain things, right? And you can see where that vulnerability would go. We actually have represented a number of boys from West Africa who are identified early on in their communities as likely going to be very tall. The irony of which, if we were in person, I'm actually 6'2" and from the Hoosier state, like where basketball is king. And so I feel like this focus on basketball is something I understand. So identify them very early on through even just like measuring different parts of their bodies. And then that helps predict who's going to be tall. And then they bring them to the United States where they play basketball for hours on end and they're promised an education, but they don't have access to it. And so I was completely unaware of that element and just have learned more and more. So it's both kind of the Olympic stuff, which I mentioned, but then even down to sort of like the pipelines that create professional athletes and then, you know, other types of arts and entertainment.
How do these people find you? And like your group?
Yes. So when we first started, we were kind of the only game in town nationally, because I didn't know when I launched the clinic that no one else was sort of hanging their shingle out to say, like, we will represent this population. People might do immigration work for trafficking survivors or child welfare work for trafficking survivors. But we were really saying, like, no, we want to see like this, like we'll serve this population. And so at the very beginning, we would just get all these sorts of calls from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, like from people all over the country. And luckily that has changed. I mean, there's lots of law firms who do pro bono, but we still get a number of referrals from the National Human Trafficking Hotline. we work really closely with law enforcement at the federal, state, and local levels, churches, shelters. You just never know where you might give a talk like this and someone will go like, oh my gosh, that happened. I mean, I deeply remember this time I drove 3 hours to give a talk at a college, and there was all of like 4 people in the audience, and I thought, oh my gosh, such a waste of my time. And then 2 years later, we got a call into the clinic of this young girl from West Africa who went into like a parish, a church, to try to get help to pay her electrical bill, like her utilities. And the church staffer screened it and realized she was being trafficked and forced to braid hair, and called the clinic. And she was one of the 4 people in the audience that day. And I was like, oh my gosh, like you never, ever know that once we put the truth out about trafficking, like where like who might do it. So yeah, you just know. So we've talked about this already. I know it's 3:49, everyone. I'm very like I'm gonna land the plane. I always land the plane. We've talked about this, but just a reminder, there's no reliable ranking in cities for child sex trafficking or prevalence of human trafficking. We just don't know. We haven't collected the data. We haven't done the hard work to know. The one thing we do is keep track of people who call in hotline tips. And so all this tells us is that the more we know about the issue, or that we talk about it as time goes on, we do identify more victims, but we have no sense of like how many of these cases are prosecuted, how many of these victims are actually helped. We just don't know. People often ask like, where do you find human trafficking? So we do this talk in Michigan a lot, but these are like a bunch of places in Michigan. Just wherever you are, I guarantee it's happening. If you're in a big city, yes, it's happening. If you're in a small town, yes, it's happening. If you're in an unincorporated village, yes, it's happening. If you live like out in the country, yes, it's happening. Like, yes. If you believe you live in a community where people don't sell drugs, then maybe it's not happening. But if people sell drugs, I guarantee you someone's profiting off of a vulnerable human being. And so we know for sure that every single state in the United States has had like documented prosecuted cases of human trafficking. And then other times people will ask, where do your clients that you see in the human trafficking clinic come from? Like, is there one place? And like we just put this map together so people could see. About half of our clients are from the United States. They're US citizens who are trafficked. And when US citizens are trafficked, it's usually in the commercial sex industry. So almost all of our US citizen clients are sex trafficking victims. We've had one US citizen client who was a labor trafficking victim. Foreign national clients can be in both. There's no, either one. And yeah, and so those are the places. And again, someone's gonna say, but like, no, but where's the most? It's just, I don't know. I can't tell you. It just is all the places. And then one thing that I feel like every time I give these talks, folks want to know, what can they do? I think one of the biggest things is when you know better about human trafficking, and you hear people talking about the myths, step in. All of you hopefully are civic participants in your communities, that you're voters and you have influence on policymakers. And so, be thoughtful about human trafficking victims when you're thinking about doing those things. I think whenever you can, take a second to think about how that thing got to you, right? Whether it's the salad in front of you, the dress that you're buying, the jeans that you're buying, and just to know that there is often a high cost for low prices. And that's not saying we should put ourselves in debt, but it does just mean in this throwaway sort of conspicuous consumption culture that we exist in, that often comes on the backs of exploited labor. And here's just another thing to know. The National Human Trafficking Hotline is available both for hotline tips, but also if you just want more information, the number's there. And then they also have a great resource center and it's there. And so if you want to learn more. So I'm totally happy to take more questions too, if you have them.
Can I ask really quickly, what is the most common mistake that people make if they were to call into this hotline and label something as human trafficking when it's not?
Before QAnon, the most common thing was just thinking that someone who wasn't white, like doing work in certain industries equaled trafficking. After QAnon, so in the now times, there is a lot of like, I saw like, I mean, you see it on TikTok and social media, like I escaped being sex trafficked because a white van drove by me in a parking lot. Like, it's just not true. And the reason, and here's like all the times I want to say, if you have been able to amass a huge response on any social media outlet because you think you were almost trafficked, I guarantee you weren't going to be a victim. Because anyone who's like potential kidnapping or assault of them would generate that kind of discussion is not going to be trafficked, right? Like I often say, like someone like me, right, who has money, power, resources, privilege, connections, I'm a trafficker's worst nightmare. If I am kidnapped, it is going to be on CNN, right? Like people are going to notice. And so I hate that on social media. It's like, no, the fact that your TikTok has 500,000 or 1 million views shows me you are not actually at risk of being trafficked. Because my clients, they could be snatched in broad daylight. And even if people are talking about it, no one's retweeting that or sending that over TikTok. So it's this idea that, or like for a while there it was, oh, look at these marks on the back of the car. That is like messaging amongst traffickers. Traffickers aren't that organized. There's like no special Slack channel that they're all talking on, you know, this doesn't happen. And so I think that's the frustrating part, that like, that somehow there's this shadow set of traffickers that are in many ways a monolith, that they all work together and they're all organized. And if you somehow see their special secret code, you can, you know, barely escape being trafficked. Yeah. So, yeah. Other questions? I can set your minds at ease. You are not at risk of being trafficked if you're on this call. I just want to tell you that, like, you are good.
Any other questions for Bridgette? Awesome, Bridgette. Thank you so much for joining us. That was amazing. And for people who couldn't join, we will absolutely share this material and obviously keep you close to the Keystone family. But thank you so much for today. We look forward to being in touch. And if people want to reach out, we'll absolutely provide your contact information.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome.
Have a great weekend.
Have a good weekend. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.